Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international questions with a major security analyst. Our guest on the Bugajski hot seat is Ambassador Daniel Fried, former diplomat and Assistant Secretary of State, active in designing US government policy in Europe after the Cold War. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled NATO's Balkan Strategy. Montenegro's imminent entry into NATO provides both momentum and opportunity for the alliance. The summit in Brussels on May 25th is an important venue to specify NATO's strategic direction in the Western Balkans. NATO has pursued two mandates in the region since the wars in the 1990s. Enlargement and intervention. The entry of Slovenia, Albania, Croatia and Montenegro demonstrates a commitment to incorporate all of Southeastern Europe in the world's most effective security structure. Concurrently, the continuing presence of NATO forces in Kosovo and the military mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina indicates that the alliance remains ready to engage if armed conflicts were to recur. Nonetheless, the current challenges to stability are not primarily military, but political, economic and informational, particularly where local disputes can be ignited through foreign subversion. And NATO can play a role by identifying vulnerabilities, promoting interstate military cooperation, detecting, deterring and defeating Russian subversion and Islamist terrorism, and bolstering steps towards NATO entry. Both Bosnia-Herzegovina and Macedonia should be designated as NATO's next members. The alliance maintains a military headquarters in Sarajevo that assists in defense reform and counter-terrorism. In 2010, NATO launched a membership action plan for Bosnia, but entry has been blocked by one obstacle: the transfer of military facilities from entity level to the central administration. This process must be accelerated. For Macedonia, a clear roadmap for membership must be applied, as the country has fulfilled its MAP requirements. The prospect of membership can contribute to reducing tensions, as both Macedonians and Albanians favour NATO entry. This will also require a more vigorous mediation process with Greece. The country can enter NATO under the designation that Greece itself uses since the Interim Accord of 1995. The former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. While NATO maintains a presence in Kosovo, it is time for Kosovo to gain a presence in NATO. NATO has helped to create a professional and multi-ethnic Kosovo security force, which will be transformed into a military structure once constitutional changes are implemented. The process can be accelerated by including Kosovo in the Partnership for Peace program to develop a modern military operating alongside NATO forces, and an important stepping stone towards membership. Serbia will prove more of a challenge for completing the NATO umbrella over the entire peninsula, but despite its Russia-friendly policy, Serbia's army participates in NATO programs since joining the PFP in 2006, and it has obtained an individual partnership action plan that could become a step towards MAP and eventual membership. If the Serbian military had a choice, free of political considerations, it would certainly favour joining the most modern and effective military organisation, rather than being linked with a second-rate Russian structure. It is time now for the Bugajski hot seat with our special guest, former diplomat and Assistant Secretary of State, Daniel Fried. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm sure our viewers in Kosovo and throughout the Balkans will be very much interested about your perspective on current developments in particular. So, to begin with, can you give us a little background on your foreign service, on particularly your intensive engagement with Europe at the end of the Cold War?
Well, that really was what my foreign service career was about, as it turned out. I came into the Foreign Service the last 10 years of the Cold War, but what I did with my 40 years was help design American policy after the Berlin Wall fell And the question for the United States and for the West generally is, what do we do now? Or to put it more specifically, do we perpetuate the line of 1945, the Yalta line, or do we try to expand the great institutions of the West to all of Europe? And the question, we actually asked ourselves, what did we fight World War II for? Was it simply to liberate Western Europe and defeat Nazi Germany, or was it to liberate all of Europe and realize the vision of the Atlantic Charter? But believe it or not, we actually had these discussions internally. The we being the small group of us who at first wanted to follow this big vision of Europe. And we had a 20-year run where we actually did it, and Kosovo, by the way, was part of this vision. We didn't start out that way, God knows. And that's a long story. But in the end, the reason we went for Kosovo independence was because it better fit this vision of an open Europe than trying to force Kosovo back into Serbia.
Looking back now, do you think more could have been done, or the maximum was achieved given American priorities elsewhere in the world?
We did all right, considering considering that the United States failed in 1919 when we turned our backs on Europe. That led to the failure of 1939 when we just weren't there. That led to the bad deal at Yalta. So in 1989, those of us aware of that history thought, by God, we cannot fail again. And I think we did all right. Could we have done more? Did we make mistakes? Well, sure. But we did a lot. And the credit there goes to George H.W. Bush at the beginning, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. And then it fell to Barack Obama to begin to defend that wider Europe against renewed Russian aggression. And so Barack Obama starts out with the reset, and he ends up leading NATO to send troops to Poland and the Baltics. That's an irony, but you had 4 presidents all doing the right thing.
Do you think that period, that immediate post-Cold War period, was in a way a window of opportunity? Because the Soviet Union had collapsed, Moscow was certainly weaker, it was more, let's say, embroiled in its domestic, its economic affairs, even keeping that country together, the Federation. So was it a window of opportunity for enlargement of NATO, strengthening of the West?
Well, of course it was. But watch out for the Russian narrative that we took advantage of them. What we did was advance freedom. And at the same time, and this was Strobe Talbot's great vision, and he was Bill Clinton's guy on Russia. He was Deputy Secretary of State. Strobe Talbot put his back into making a place for Russia among the democracies of the world in hopes that Russia would become one of the great democracies of the world. We tried, and it wasn't just NATO enlargement. It was development of a parallel NATO-Russia relationship. So we were not trying to exclude Russia, but we were not going to give Russia an empire in Europe. We would embrace Russia as a nation state and as a democracy, and that's what we tried to do, in hopes that that's what they would become.
That's what I mean by that window of opportunity. In other words, where we could actually talk to them, where at one point they even seemed to want to be a normal democratic country. But that all changed under Putin, as we know.
Well, the story of why Russia did not succeed is a long and difficult one. And ultimately, the Russians are responsible for that. I don't want to be, though, too unforgiving. They faced enormous difficulties that we, I think, underestimated. We looked at Russia as liberated from communism, which was true but only partly true. It was also, 1991 was also an imperial collapse.
Exactly.
And Russia rolled back to the borders of the mid-17th century. And I think we underestimated that trauma.
Because we looked, well, for the Central Europeans, it wasn't just liberation from communism, it was national liberation from Moscow.
Well, it was both. And the genius, frankly, of the Baltic and Polish liberation movements especially, is that this was nationalism in a liberal and democratic form. It was patriotism. And that was a that was the work of really right, left, and center politicians in all those countries.
Right.
I think old Yugoslavia had a window, and one of the tragedies is that they didn't take it either. They didn't take it.
Do you think in some ways, before we come to the contemporary picture, do you think in some ways Yugoslavia fell between the cracks? Because we were so focused on what was happening further east, Soviet Union, former Soviet bloc. There was also the distraction, of course, of the war in Kuwait. At that time, we didn't focus enough on Yugoslavia and the kind of violent conflicts that then ensued.
Maybe. But when I think of missed opportunities and mistakes, I would put our sin of omission, so to speak, a little earlier. I think there was a window in the 86 to 88 period before Milosevic gave that hyper-nationalist speech in 1989, when we could have spoken to him before he had gone too far. And I think we were inattentive. I don't think we took it seriously enough. In retrospect, the warning signs were there. I knew people in the American embassy who spotted it, but we didn't take it seriously. So I think the problem was not 89, 90, 91. I think by then we were fighting against an avalanche.
Yeah.
I think we had and missed an earlier opportunity.
Although at that point we were still talking about keeping Yugoslavia together.
Well, sure, understandably. And I think a lot of people in old Yugoslavia, people have said privately to me, we're sorry it fell apart. I mean, think about it. If Yugoslavia had democratized and become a manageable democratic federation, it would have joined NATO, it would have joined the European Union, it would have been much wealthier than any of its post-communist neighbors.
Sure.
It already had a good start. It didn't take that path, and it was a tragedy. So here we are.
Here we are, and also here we are with the new American administration, which has spent the last couple of months taking shape. How would you summarize its first few months in office? We've had over 100 days now, on the foreign and security policy side, I mean.
Well, if you take simply the policies that have been articulated, what Secretary of State Tillerson, Defense Secretary Mattis, National Security Advisor McMaster has said, there is a great deal, in fact, most of the policy prescriptions have been within the mainstream of American foreign policy since 1945. They have said that NATO is important, that we will respect Article 5. They have called for NATO members to respect the political commitments to 2% of their GDP in annual defense spending, which is not new. Defense Secretary Gates, pretty strong about that in the Obama administration. Strong on Russia. That is, they've talked about maintaining sanctions, pushed back on Russian, some of the more extravagant Russian demands. I think the tougher policy on North Korea that's emerging frankly, goes where the Obama administration was headed anyway. So I think that's all to the good. But the campaign, and at some point since, there was language used, this emphasis on America first, only America first, which raised understandable concerns. What does that mean, America first?
Doesn't it have two meanings? Well, it could mean America alone first, or America as a leader first.
It has a couple of, I would say there are two ways to interpret it. One is the way I would like to interpret it. Of course, as an American diplomat, I was looking out for the interests of my country. But those interests, properly understood, means we Americans are prosperous and secure if and only if our neighbors and our chief partners are also prosperous and secure. A weak and divided Europe does nothing for us. A world where aggressive dictators run amok does nothing for us. We, after 1945, the United States tried to make the world a better place, and in so doing, we and the Europeans all got rich. this was not a bad idea. And we wanted that prosperity to go to East Asia, and it did in South Korea and Japan, and spreading to Southeast Asia and Mexico. A weak, unhappy Mexico does nothing good for us. A prosperous, democratic Mexico is what we want. So that is my definition of what America First ought to mean. But of course, there's another definition, which is, first, rooted in the isolationist and, frankly, pro-Nazi, in some cases, pro-Nazi movement of late 1930s and early 1940. Right. And I'm not going to pretty it up. America First was a cover to keep us out of World War II and basically leave the continent of Europe to Adolf Hitler. So I have trouble getting past America First for that reason, but quite apart from that, if it means America only, and that we will beat up on other nations to take our share, and that we prefer a sphere of influence world in which the strong bully the weak, that is not only runs counter to our American ideals, it runs counter to our interests. Sure. We don't need a sphere of influence of our own to dominate our neighbors. What we need is a rules-based world. That's going to work better for Americans and better for the world.
Sure. Do you think Trump was trumpeting, if you like, absorbing a lot of this populist, jingoist, nationalist, isolationist agenda during the course of the campaign, and is now coming around to a more traditional, centrist, internationalist approach?
Well, I don't know. I hope so. And there is certainly some evidence of that. The biggest single example I would pick to advance your point is that in defending the missile strikes on Syrian targets, President Trump used language which Bill Clinton or George W. Bush would have been comfortable using. That is, holding a nation to account for its actions and its violation of human rights, and holding as a standard a multilateral arms control treaty, the Chemical Weapons Treaty, as a standard to which governments have to be held accountable. Now that's a very different view than the nationalist version of America First that popped up in the campaign. So I hope that is a sign. And if you want to be in an optimistic frame of mind, sure, there's some evidence for that.
We'll see how it continues. All new administrations that come in have one approach, and it's usually counters what the previous administration did. In other words, I'm not an anti-Obama, I'm an anti-Obama, an anti-Bush. But something happens that is unpredictable, that is major, that affects national security, and it changes our policies and priorities. Can you see something on the horizon with this administration, with the Trump administration, that could change its approach?
Well, all administrations take time to deal with reality. All right, this is universal. All administrations come into office thinking that their predecessors were fools, and that we, not being fools, can get it right. Sometimes this shows itself when presidents think they can do some deal with Russia. And there's usually a learning curve. And there may be a learning curve in this case. But that period can be costly. Now, it's the nature of the world that it gives you surprises. I can tell you on the morning of September 11th, I had a whole other day planned in the White House. I never got back to that schedule. The point is, the world will throw you curveballs and surprises. And when that happens, you fall back on your deeper core beliefs. Presidents have remarked on this as they gain experience. President Obama said the presidency magnifies you, your virtues and your flaws.
So what are Trump's core beliefs?
Well, we're going to find out. He has a history of saying things, a history back to the 1980s, which are consistent with some of the more troubling America First approaches. He said that Gorbachev was too weak. He's expressed approval of what the Chinese did at Tiananmen Square. He talked about our allies ripping us off. He was very down on Japan. So those are things that are part of the record.
And Putin is a strong leader, whatever that
And
means.
then he said that later. But I was talking about things then businessman and real estate developer Donald Trump said and said publicly. On the other hand, right, and in defense of the administration, there have been a number of other statements. And the president's foreign trip is going to reveal a lot of this. We're going to see. But there are a number of concerns that have been raised in the United States and in Europe about where American foreign policy is going. I think that the power of American strategy tends to be underestimated. I think all administrations since 1945 have operated consistent with a broad vision of American leadership in the world, and something I call America's grand strategy, which has been a broad definition of the American interest. So I think there are powerful forces which may move this administration in that direction, and I certainly hope so.
Coming to a very specific question, the future of NATO, which, as you know, Trump criticized at one point during the campaign that it was obsolete, that NATO wasn't paying its way, that implying that America may not defend certain countries that don't spend a certain percentage of their GDP on national defense. But things seem to be changing. I mean, he's now confirmed that NATO is no longer obsolete. He did that in the White House with Secretary Stoltenberg.
Okay.
And he's actually attending the NATO summit in Brussels later this month.
And I think he's going to meet with the leaders of the European Union.
Yes.
Which is also...
I'll come back to the European Union in a second and the connections between the two, but how do you see now the future of NATO? Is there a sort of reinvigoration of NATO?
Well, I think NATO has done a remarkable job in continuing to stay relevant despite shifting emphases and priorities. So the debate in the Bush administration was how to equip NATO to function out of area and take on post-9/11 challenges. The idea that NATO was not taking on counterterrorism as a major objective is simply not true. Non-U.S. NATO forces lost 1,000 people in Afghanistan. So NATO was there. Now, the Bush administration talked about NATO's expeditionary forces. I remember that a number of Europeans, the Poles, in the Bush administration said, okay, we'll sign on to this, but don't forget classic Article 5 and Russia. And under the Obama administration, NATO took steps, in fact, the strongest steps it's ever taken with respect to giving, strengthening our ability on the ground to carry out Article 5 missions, which means putting forces into the Baltics and Poland. That's serious. These are American forces, non-U.S. NATO forces. So NATO has found, I think, a pretty good balance and a way forward under shifting conditions.
This took a little bit of time, though. It wasn't until the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we had to start issuing reassurances, particularly to the Baltic states and the Poles, that NATO will respect Article 5. And as a result of this, the forward presence bases and so forth were developed. Do you think Trump is committed to this, to the American and the Allied troop presence along the Eastern Front?
Well, it's there. And it hasn't been pulled back. It hasn't been changed. It hasn't been put on hold. So I'm confident that we're in the right place on this. And it's important that we stay in the right place on this. But this is one of the great achievements of the Obama administration, and it was in the tradition of both Presidents Bush and President Clinton. So I'm deliberately pointing out the bipartisan continuity of policy, and so far the Trump administration is following in this path. This is good.
And bipartisanship has also clearly been on display in the Balkans, which I'd like to come to next. Right. In terms of, as you mentioned at the outset, the recognition of Kosovo, the status of Kosovo, which happened through several administrations, well, from the Clinton all the way through to the Obama administration. Right. Now we have a major development, which is Montenegro's accession to NATO as the 29th member. The first country, actually, I think, since the Adriatic three came in.
It is. That's true.
So what would you say is the next step for NATO in the region? Are there other contenders, imminent contenders for enlargement, for membership?
The accession of Montenegro to NATO is important because it shows that NATO is not a closed club, and that the reach of the great institutions of the West is not over. So that's important. The candidates for NATO membership in the future have a lot of work to do. And NATO is, I don't think, ready to start considering Georgia or Ukrainian NATO membership at this time. But the Montenegro accession shows that it's not, that NATO accession is not done. Not forever. Now, I don't want to push this forward, and the Ukrainians and the Georgians, frankly, are not getting the same deal that the Poles and the Baltics got.
Sure.
All right? And that, they can complain about that, and I understand that. But the Ukrainians did not reform themselves in the 90s the way the Poles did. And so that's, sometimes windows of opportunity pass. Not forever. Not forever.
New ones sometimes open. Right.
Well, we should be careful about what I call straight lining. That is, assuming that current trends are going to go on that way forever. Now, really? Like, if you straight line trends between 1983 and 1985, where would you end up? Well, not where we ended up in 1989. So be careful not to straight line is one of my tactical rules. And another is, don't overestimate what you can achieve in the short run, because it's usually not as much as you think. But don't underestimate what you can achieve in the long run.
So for the other NATO contenders, particularly Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, potentially Kosovo, there is a path to NATO.
Well, the path to NATO starts with getting your house in order. All right? The Poles and the Balts were regarded as impossible candidates for NATO membership. And it was just ludicrous and laughable to think of them as NATO members. And I'm speaking of the prevailing wisdom in this town, in Washington, D.C., in 1989 till about 1992.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay? It was an article of faith that NATO enlargement would never happen.
Even the Poles didn't think they would get in. So.
Well, now, what changed that? And the principal factor was not so much the foreign policy insurgents, of which I was one back in those days, 25 years ago, but really the developments on the ground. The Poles did at home what they needed to do. The Baltics did at home what they needed to do. And then they were able to go to the West and say, what is your problem? Now, they didn't put it that way, but it was basically the subtext. Sure. What more do you want? And I remember a great internal debate during the Clinton administration where one of the opponents of NATO membership said, we can't possibly put together criteria for NATO membership because what are we going to do if they meet the criteria? And I thought to myself, all right, if our policy is that God forbid they should actually become stable, prospering, functioning democracies, then our policy is just wrong and stupid. And we have to change it. So the lesson for countries like Kosovo that want to be NATO members is fix things at home, work on your democracy, work on corruption, build your state for which you fought so long. Do what you said you were going to do. Don't become a copy of everything you hated about Serbian domination, the corruption, the violence, the phony democracy of the Milosevic period. You do that, And then you generate political capital for yourselves, which your friends and you will put to use when that time comes again.
What is your view of the so-called neutrality or non-alignment in the current international setting? Serbian government, for example, keeps saying we want to remain non-aligned. Ukrainians, if you remember, before the Orange Revolution under Kuchma, were saying we're non-vector, non-block policy. We have Sweden and Finland that are supposedly neutral countries,
Well,
although there is pressure on them, I know, from Russia, but also more internal pro-NATO factors. Where does, the reason I'm asking is, where do you see neutrality now as an international status?
I'd like to distinguish two things. I think neutrality doesn't belong in the current political vocabulary. Neutral between what? Democracy and dictatorship? The rule of law and massive corruption?
Independence and imperialism?
Yeah. Well, what's neutral?
Right.
However, that's not to say that we want to pressure Serbia into wanting to join NATO. Not at all. NATO is not the Warsaw Pact. We don't want NATO members except if they want to be NATO members. If there is nothing that says we can't have good relations with Serbia while it stays outside of NATO. What? Finland's outside of NATO. There's a debate in Finland about whether it should join. It's not a debate we need to participate in. And what Serbia wants to do is up to the Serbs. Now, that's all. It's up to them. And there are cultural ties with Russia, Pravoslavny, Cyrillic alphabet, some good history. There's some other history. I don't think Russia was always such a good ally of Serbia, but that's not for Americans to say. That's for Serbs to decide. And they have to decide where their national destiny lies and where they want it to lie, and it's up to them.
And presumably the Serbian military would want to be part of the most modern international military organization rather than being linked with a sort of second-rate Russian force.
Well, that, again, sure, but it's not for an American. It's not for an American to tell Serbia what it should want. It's for Serbia to decide where it belongs. And I think Serbia's whole history from the self-liberation from the Ottomans has been toward Europe. And it's been blocked and stymied and frustrated by a lot of historical bad events, some of which may have been partly Serbia's fault, but most of them were not. But that's up, again, Serbia, that is Serbia's call. And I think it was terrible that Serbia fell back. I remember a time when Romanians were literally risking their lives to cross the Danube to get to Belgrade. And Belgrade was the freest, most prosperous, most European Balkan capital that existed. That's true. And now
it was almost part of the West.
Well, there were many of us who hoped that in the late 1980s, Yugoslavia would undertake the reforms to actually get it there. And it might have. I don't think Milosevic was inevitable. I don't think Milosevic is the apotheosis of the Serbian soul. Not at all. Not at all. I knew a number of Serbian liberal thinkers. They were just as Serb as, as the nationalists. More so because they were looking out for Serbian interests better than the nationalists were. But it's for Serbs to decide.
Dan, let's turn now to the EU. As you know, the EU is, some would say, embroiled in an existential crisis. Let's say with Brexit, with the growth of populism, nationalism. There have been some reversals of the reversals recently, with the French elections, obviously, and the German elections beginning to look positive. But nevertheless, what would be the impact of an ongoing EU crisis on NATO itself, on the transatlantic alliance?
Well, I would say that not just Europe, but Europe and the United States are going through a similar period where what some people call the liberal world order, but I would prefer to call the free world order, is under assault from this time from the nationalist right. Now, it used to be under assault from the hard left back in the 70s. Well, and in the 40s from the Stalinist left. But now it's the hard right, the nationalist right. And it's not just Eastern Europe. It's not just, you know, the Front National. It's common to both sides of the Atlantic.
I'm glad you made this point about the liberal international order, because that is a strange concept.
I don't like the phrase.
No, I don't either, because you know why? Because the nationalists will say, well, we're conservative, so it's the conservative world order.
I understand the meaning of liberal, meaning rooted in the Enlightenment. Okay, fine, but if you have to explain a phrase, it's probably not the right phrase.
That's why I like the free world order.
I like it too.
Yeah.
Besides, I believe, and have always believed, that there is a place in the free world for patriotism, for national identity, for national pride. And I believe that one of the challenges for the United States and for Europe, but particularly in Europe, is to find a space for a definition of the nation which is rooted in culture and language, but not ethnicity. And by the way, let's be honest, traditional ethnicities are usually composites anyway. English ethnicity, what's that except a composite of Celts, Romans, Britons, Danes, Vikings, Germans, Saxons, Angles, that all became English.
Not to
okay,
mention...
and then the Normans. Okay, that's English. My point is not that English nationality doesn't exist. Of course it does. Of course it does. But the notion of nation as ethnic purity is both impossible and historically false. Now, I say that as an American because we're a nation of all nationalities, and we're joined together by English language, by common culture, and by what Lincoln called the old Declaration, the Declaration of Independence, and the founding principle of America, that we are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, is this only for America, or is this larger vision possible for Europe? It's different for Europe. But I would argue that Serbian nationality or German nationality can be cultural and historical, and that the Serbs will always study the Obrenovićes and the Karađorđevićes and Kosovo Polje and all the rest of it. But it needs to take shape in a way which is not hyper-nationalist.
I'm glad you mentioned England, Brexit.
Yeah.
What impact is this going to have on NATO? Some say that, look, if the Brits are out of the EU, they're going to have less economic and commercial interests in defending European Union.
You know, I actually don't think so. Look, I'm no fan of Brexit. Okay, I didn't like the rhetoric. I thought it was a dumb move. Okay, but that said, it's here. Can't scream and yell about it, and I think the Brits are actually going to show that they are committed to Europe.
To defend European security.
Well, but also to working with the EU. I think Prime Minister May did a great thing during her visit when she made clear to this administration that Britain is not anti-EU. They do not look to encourage other countries getting out of the EU, but they want to work with the EU. And I think that the British are going to be pro-NATO. I think they will go out of their way to show that they are pro-NATO. So, do I love Brexit? No. Can we make Brexit work? Sure. The job of diplomats, the reason governments hire people like me is to make this stuff work. All right? If we're doing our job, we'll make it work. I don't have to love it, but I don't have to love a lot of things. We can make it work.
Turning to Brexit and the EU specifically, Britain was at the forefront of wider rather than deeper. In other words, trying to bring in other countries, particularly from the Balkans, into the European Union. Is that going to weaken now because the British are no longer within decision-making?
Well, this is an interesting challenge. I think the EU suffers from what I would call a democratic deficit, by which I mean that the most democratic institution in Europe is the Parliament, and it doesn't have a lot of power. And the Commission, which I happen to think is pretty effective and well run. I've worked with them closely. I actually like them, but they are seen as an alien force. So, and there are no European leaders who've tried to develop an all-European constituency. The European Union chooses its leaders on the basis of kind of a consensus inside ball.
Right.
Now, I happen to think that Donald Tusk is an extraordinarily gifted leader. He was a good prime minister in Poland. Sort of younger generation solidarity, generation of Poland's great success. So I have a lot of respect for him. He's good. But he and other European leaders, and particularly the next generation, are going to have to find ways to develop European-wide constituencies. Easier said than done. And look, as an American, who am I to tell Europeans about their politics? They might have a thing or two to say about ours, which I recognize and I'm willing to hear it. But you see my point. The European Union needs to deepen its connection with European citizens, and it may have to do that by recognizing the role of the nation state, but not at the expense of European institutions. I think that circle can be squared, but it's going to take a lot of effort. And I think the best news in Europe for a long time has been the election of Emmanuel Macron. He ran on an explicitly pro-European platform, and he didn't apologize. He didn't step back. He didn't try to co-opt the nationalists by being a little bit nationalist himself. He came out with a full pro-European, pro-free world agenda. And I think that he will make an excellent partner for Chancellor Merkel.
This takes us nicely, actually, to the American position on the European Union. Again, during the Trump election campaign, Donald Trump expressed support for Brexit. Unfortunately, he happened to be in Scotland at the time, which voted against the Brexit, but nevertheless.
Right.
Will this continue, in other words, or has he realized that America's better off with an integrated European Union rather than a disintegrating European Union?
I mentioned Prime Minister May. Now here's something Chancellor Merkel did, which was just spot on. It was just great. So the Americans, people in the Trump White House were talking about how horrible it is to do trade negotiations in a multilateral form.
Right.
You know, that we can't do that. We need bilateral trade agreements. And Merkel pointed out the obvious, which is, yes, you're right, which is why dealing with the European Union is a good thing, because you're dealing with a single actor. Do you really prefer 27, 28 bilateral negotiations? Are you crazy? Now, those are my words, not hers, but I'm familiar with the Chancellor's style, and she can be both logical and effective.
So you think the point was taken in the White House?
I hope so. I think that was a good point. A lot of President Trump's arguments can be answered without the more extravagant solutions. America first? Sure. But understand that America first requires work with a strong, successful Europe and Japan and Korea and a rules-based world. If you want to advance American interests, you can only do so if you're advancing other people's. It's not zero-sum.
Right. Again, for many months, there seemed to be a struggle between two streams within the White House. This, as you mentioned, this populist, nationalist, isolationist, and this America in the world. America needs allies. It needs good, strong allies, needs an integrated Europe. The latter seems to be winning out, I think.
Well, I think so, and I certainly hope so. No need to tell people in Kosovo or the Balkans what happens when you give political running room to the nationalists without check. Yeah. You like that? You enjoy the last 20 years, did you?
Right.
They know. They know better, perhaps, than some Americans. Because to us, the memory of World War II is, well, memory. It's living memory, but not for much longer. And for Europeans and for the Balkans, it's real.
And it's still a nightmare somewhere in the
as it should be.
Subconscious.
And that is the antidote to nationalism.
Let us turn down, because we only have a few minutes left, to Russia, one of my favorite subjects. You've mentioned in many ways about windows of opportunity, Russia as an authoritarian state, not a democracy. How would you see, under Putin now, Russian revisionism, Russian imperialism developing and affecting Europe?
Well, Russia is putting pressure on the institutions of the West. Russia tried to interfere in our elections. Russia was trying to interfere in the French elections. Russia has contempt and really animosity toward democratic institutions of the West and the West in general. And it wants to show that the West is decadent and corrupt. The better to secure Putin's style of rule, consider what happens to Russian authoritarianism if Ukraine's reforms succeed. Kyiv is a largely Russian-speaking Pravoslavny city. If Ukraine became a democratizing, Europeanizing, successful country, what does that mean for Russia? Well, I'll tell you one thing it means. It means that this notion that Russians are incapable of democracy, that they need a strong hand, that all they know is authoritarianism, is nonsense. I think it's nonsense. I don't think the Russians are genetically predisposed toward authoritarianism.
But they're fed that from cradle to grave.
I think it's nonsense.
Yeah.
I think it's nonsense. Russia is not inferior to the West. In the generation before 1917, Russia was not only pulling even with the West, it was a leader of the West in literature, art, music, culture generally, drawing very close in science, engineering, and it had a rapidly converging economy. All right, this was Russia. And Russia is perfectly capable of becoming something different than what it is today. Now, there are some people who say, oh, Russia's a different civilization. Yeah, Russia, sure, is different. All countries are different. Spain is different. The United States, God knows, is different. But Russia is perfectly capable of drawing even and becoming a leader of a broader West, if it so chooses, which means, in my view, that the responsibility is on Russia's leaders.
Can the West hasten this process of Russia's democratization or contribute to it?
It's not up to us, but I think it is important to resist Russian aggression. We should resist Russian aggression because we don't think dictators or authoritarians should be able to change borders by war in Europe. Secondly, we should not fall victim to the old view that internal affairs have nothing to do with the rest of the world. That's not true.
No.
A country's foreign policy reflects its internal policy. And it was both Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan who came to the conclusion that human rights were indeed our business. That doesn't mean we try to export democracy, but it does mean that we stand with democratic forces. Sure. In Russia's history, periods of reform occur when external aggression fails. And external aggression is what Russia does when it feels itself incapable of reforming at home.
So, in a way, echoes of Afghanistan.
Well, you know, I am reminded a little bit now of the period of Zastoy, stagnation.
Right.
The early 1980s, under late Brezhnev, when Russians began to realize and started whispering, we can't go on like this. I do believe that democracy is the wave of the future, but I don't believe in linear progress, unfortunately. History throws you back.
Mm-hmm.
If you went back to 1900 and told a German, in 115 years, you're going to be free, prosperous, surrounded by friends, with your security never better, they would have said, great. And then you would have had to add, but wait. You're not going to enjoy the next 40, 50 years.
And of course, Europe you can't just rest on your laurels even when you have regained independence and building a democracy.
Well, Europe has to stand up. The United States has to remember who we are. And the great democracies of the world need to get together, or the world will be run by the great authoritarians.
Perfect note to finish on. Somber note, but an important note. Wake-up call, I think. Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure.
Good to see you.
Likewise.
And good luck in sort of semi-retirement now, but you're going on to the private think tank sector, so welcome aboard.
That seems to be a good place for somebody like me.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues at VOA and at RTK. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Miro Pavshim.